On a Tuesday morning in March of 2025, Walter Cole walked into a Cedar Falls courthouse to dispute a $312 bank fee. He was 72 years old. He had driven 40 minutes to do this. The bank on the other side of that argument had $4 billion in assets and was 11 weeks away from closing a $47 million real estate deal. What the bank did not know, what no one in that building had known for 62 years, was that one of the properties in that deal had never legally belonged to them. And Walter Cole had the document that proved it. He carried it in a padded envelope under his arm, sealed with 2 strips of brown packing tape, labeled in black marker in his own handwriting with 2 words and a letter, 7 Alpha. The woman sitting at the respondent's table that morning had reviewed the case file over breakfast in Des Moines. It had taken her 9 minutes. She had refilled her coffee once during that time and had not thought about the case again until she parked her car in Cedar Falls. Her name was Sandra Mercer. She was 44 years old, represented Great Plains National Bank, and had been in enough of these rooms to know exactly how they ended. An old man with a grievance and a document from 60 years ago. She had seen the type before. Stubborn, certain of a small injustice, easily satisfied once you showed them the math. She was about to have the worst morning of her professional career. Let me tell you about Harold Cole, because a man like this deserves to be told about properly. And to understand what happened in that courtroom in 2025, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to Iowa in 1961, to a 30-year-old farmer standing at the edge of a 2-acre strip of ground at the intersection of Highway 14 and County Road 22, looking at a man from the bank who wanted to buy what was underneath his feet. Harold Raymond Cole was not a large man. He stood 5'10" in his work boots, which he had resoled the previous winter, and expected to resole again before they gave out entirely. He had the kind of build that comes from 20 years of physical work. Not big, but dense. The kind of strength that does not advertise itself. His hands were the most telling thing about him. They were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime in conversation with metal and soil and wood hands that knew the difference between a bolt that was tight and a bolt that was about to strip hands that could read the moisture content of dirt by feel, in the way that a musician reads sheet music by sight. He had inherited 180 acres from his own father. In 1953, at the age of 22, along with a set of equipment that was already 15 years old, and a lesson his father had delivered on the morning of the inheritance, in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. The lesson was this: the bank will always be willing to lend you more than you should borrow. Your job is to know the difference between what you can borrow and what you can afford to owe. Those are not the same number. They will never be the same number. And the man who confuses them loses the farm. Harold had written that down in his first cloth-bound ledger that same afternoon. He had been keeping ledgers since he was 19 years old, a habit his father had modeled and Harold had adopted with the thoroughness that characterized everything he did. Not journals in the personal sense, records. Dates, numbers, decisions, outcomes. The paper record of a life operated on the principle that what you cannot account for can be taken from you, and what you can account for fully and precisely cannot. By 1961, he had 3 ledgers filled and a 4th underway. He had a wife named Ruth, who had grown up on a farm 12 miles east and understood the work in the way that only someone raised inside it can understand it. He had a son named Walter, who was 8 years old, and already showing the particular fascination with machinery that would eventually take him off the farm and into a garage in Dubuque. And he had a problem, which was that his primary tractor, a 1948 Farmall that had served him well for 13 years, had finally reached the point where the cost of keeping it running was approaching the cost of replacing it. He needed a new machine. He needed financing to get one. And a man from Farmers Trust of Cedar Falls had driven out to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in late June to offer him a solution that came with a condition attached. The condition was the 2-acre strip at the corner of Highway 14 and County Road 22. Farmers Trust wanted a branch location on that corner. The parcel fronted the main road, had good visibility from both directions, and sat at the junction that most of the county traffic passed through on its way to and from the grain elevators. The bank's representative, a man named Gerald Alderson, who wore a tie and drove a 2-year-old Buick, had come prepared with an offer to purchase. He had a number written on a piece of paper that he slid across the kitchen table to Harold, with the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times. Harold had looked at the number. He had picked up his coffee cup. He had set it back down. Then he had told Alderson that he was not interested in selling. Alderson had been surprised, which he showed in the small way that trained salesmen show surprise, a slight adjustment of posture, a recalibration behind the eyes. He had asked Harold what kind of arrangement he might consider instead. What followed was a 2-hour conversation that Ruth listened to from the kitchen doorway, refilling coffee, when the cups ran low and saying nothing, which was her version of paying very close attention. At the end of it, Harold and Gerald Alderson had the framework of a deal. A 99-year lease on the 2 acres, favorable financing for the new equipment, and written into the agreement in language that Alderson had initially resisted, and Harold had simply waited out in the patient way. He waited out most resistance, a permanent waiver of all administrative, clerical, and records-related fees on any account held by Harold Raymond Cole or his direct heirs for the duration of those accounts. Harold had insisted on that last clause for a reason he did not explain to Alderson, and that Alderson, focused on closing the lease, had eventually agreed to without fully considering its implications. The reason was this: Harold Cole did not trust institutions to remember what they had promised, and he had decided that if he was going to give a bank access to a prime corner of his property for 99 years, he was going to extract from them something that would require them to acknowledge that relationship every time they touched his accounts. A fee waiver was a small thing monetarily. It was not a small thing as a mechanism of memory. The agreement was signed on July 14, 1961. The parcel was designated as Parcel 7 Alpha. Harold had the document notarized, made 2 copies, kept one in the filing cabinet in the barn office and one in the fireproof safe beneath the workbench. And then he went back to farming. That evening he wrote in his ledger, "Executed lease on 7 Alpha with Farmers Trust. 99 years from today's date. Fee waiver on all Cole accounts per Article 6. Gerald Alderson signed for the bank. I will not see the end of this agreement. Walter might. Have you ever had someone in your life make a decision on your behalf before you were old enough to understand what they were doing? Before you were old enough to even know there was a decision to be made?" That is what Harold Cole did on the 14th of July, 1961. He was 30 years old, and he was thinking about his 8-year-old son's future and his 8-year-old son's children's future and the generation after that. Most men make decisions for today. A few make decisions for next year. Harold Cole made a decision that was designed to matter 62 years later, and then he put it in the safe and went back to work. The following spring, construction began on the Cedar Falls branch of Farmers Trust at the corner of Highway 14 and County Road 22. Harold watched it go up from the cab of his new tractor, a machine he had financed on terms that left him comfortable rather than stretched. and he did not say anything to anyone about the arrangement that made it possible. That was not his way. He simply noted the progress in his ledger every few weeks, the way he noted everything and filed the thought away with the precision he brought to all things. 1963 arrived the way that bad years often arrive in Iowa, which is to say it arrived looking like a normal year and did not reveal its intentions until it was too late to do much about them. The spring was wet. The planting was late. And on the 4th of March, a Friday afternoon when Harold was in the barn, working on the hydraulic lift of his planter, Gerald Alderson's car pulled into the drive. Alderson was not alone this time. He had brought a younger man whose name Harold never learned, a man in a newer suit who stood slightly back and to the left of Alderson the way that men stand when they are there to witness something, rather than to participate in it. They had a document. Alderson said they had come by to clear up a small matter, that there had been some confusion in the records department, that a deed had been prepared some months back regarding the 7 Alpha parcel, and they wanted to make sure Harold had a copy for his files. He held the document out across the hood of his car with the smooth confidence of a man delivering routine paperwork. Harold wiped his hands on a shop rag and took the document. He read the title, Deed of Sale and Transfer. He read the first paragraph. He read the section describing the grantor. He read the section describing the grantee. He read the date, March 4th, 1963. Then he looked at the signature line. His name was there, Harold R. Cole. Block letters beneath a signature he did not recognize as his own. He looked at the document for a long moment without speaking. Alderson began to say something about the records department and standard procedures, and Harold held up one hand, not a gesture of aggression, simply a signal that he needed quiet to read. And Alderson went quiet. Harold read the document through to the end. Then he folded it. Then he said, "I have not signed this document." Alderson said there must be some confusion, and he was sure they could sort it out. He said these things sometimes happened during the processing of large loan portfolios, that paperwork occasionally got mixed up, that it was nothing to be concerned about. Harold looked at him. He did not say anything for a moment. He had the kind of face that did not perform emotion readily, a face that had been weathered by 30 years of Iowa seasons into something that resembled patience, even when patience was not precisely what was happening underneath it. What was happening underneath it at that moment was a very precise and rapid calculation. He said he would look into it and be in touch. Alderson said that would be fine, and he hoped they could get it sorted out quickly. He shook Harold's hand, which Harold permitted, and then drove back down the gravel road with the younger man sitting silently in the passenger seat. Harold stood in the drive for a moment after the car turned onto the county road. Then he walked back into the barn, set the document on the workbench under the light, and examined it the way he examined anything he needed to understand, methodically, without assumptions, starting at the beginning and working toward the end. He found the problem in the legal description. The 1963 deed purported to transfer Parcel 7 Alpha, but the metes and bounds in the body of the document, the specific coordinates that defined the parcel being transferred, the language that began at the northeast corner of the described property and ran south along the fence line, did not match the survey boundaries of 7 Alpha as Harold knew them, as Harold had walked them, as Harold had marked them with his own posts and measured them with his own tape in the summer of 1961, before the lease was signed. They matched instead the boundaries of a smaller strip of ground to the east of 7 Alpha, a strip that Harold had always thought of informally as 7 Beta, though that designation was his own and appeared nowhere in any official document, a strip that was in fact still fully his unencumbered, and that he had been intending to sell to his neighbor Dale Henderson for a grain elevator access road at some point in the next few years when Dale got around to expanding his operation. The documents described two different pieces of land. Someone at Farmers Trust had either made an error so significant it defied easy explanation, or had done something that Harold Cole did not yet have a word for but understood with perfect clarity. He sat alone in the barn office that night, after Ruth had gone to bed. The light through the north-facing window was the particular blue-black of a March night in Iowa, and the cold came through the walls in the way it comes through old walls, not as a draft, but as a presence. He had the 1963 deed on the workbench in front of him, and beside it the original 1961 lease agreement he had retrieved from the filing cabinet, and beside that the survey maps he had commissioned before the lease was signed, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. He compared them. He did not need to compare them for long. The discrepancy was not subtle. Whoever had drawn up the 1963 deed had either used the wrong survey or had not used a survey at all. He thought about his options for a long time. He could call a lawyer. He could go to the county recorder's office. He could drive to Farmers Trust on Monday morning and put the document on Gerald Alderson's desk and ask him to explain it in terms that a farmer might understand. He could do all of those things. He understood that all of those things might work. He also understood something else, which was that Gerald Alderson had driven to his farm with a witness and a document that bore a forged signature, and had presented that document with the smooth confidence of a man who expected it to be accepted. That confidence meant one of two things. Either Alderson believed Harold would not look closely, or Alderson believed that even if Harold looked closely, there was nothing Harold could do about it. Harold had spent 30 years farming ground that people had underestimated. He understood something about patience that most people who had not spent their lives watching seeds become crops could not quite grasp. The right time for a thing was not always the time you first encountered it. The work that mattered most was often the work you did in the dark alone when no one was watching and no one would see the outcome for years. He got up from the workbench. He went to the fireproof safe. He opened it and retrieved the copy of the 1961 lease agreement he kept there. He put the 1963 deed inside and locked the safe. Then he sat back down at the workbench and opened his ledger to the next blank page and wrote in his precise hand everything that had happened that afternoon in the exact order it had happened. He included Alderson's words as he remembered them. He included the name of the parcel in the 1963 deed, and the name of the parcel the metes and bounds actually described. He included the date and time and the fact that a second man had been present whose name he did not know. At the bottom of the entry in letters that were slightly smaller than the rest, because he had reached the end of the page and there was not much room left, he added 9 words. I do not know if this will be enough. I am going to act as though it will be. He closed the ledger. He put it back on the shelf. He turned off the light in the barn office and walked through the cold to the house and went to bed. In the morning, he got up and read to Walter from the almanac over breakfast, because that was what they did on Saturdays, and then he went out to finish the hydraulic lift on the planter, because the ground was almost ready, and he was behind enough already without losing another day. He did not mention the visit from Alderson to Ruth for 3 days. When he did, he told her the facts in the order they had occurred without editorializing. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was how she listened to things that required her full attention. When he finished, she asked one question. She asked if the farm was in danger. Harold said no. He said the document described the wrong parcel, and the wrong parcel was not in the agreement. He said as long as the agreement existed and the ledger entry existed and the survey maps existed, the situation was documented. Ruth said, "Then, what do you do now?" Harold said, "Keep farming." Ruth looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been married to a particular kind of man long enough to understand that what he means and what he says are sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. Then she said, "All right," and went back to the books she kept for the farm accounts, and that was the end of the conversation. What happened next is the part that people who hear this story find the hardest to understand. Because what Harold Cole did after March of 1963 was nothing. He kept farming. He planted that spring behind schedule because of the wet weather and brought in a crop that was below average, but above the break-even line he had calculated in his ledger. He paid his equipment loan on schedule. He maintained his accounts at Farmers Trust the same way he always had. He walked the fence line of his property every March, the way his own father had taught him checking posts and wire and the creek bed, where the water sometimes undercut the bank during snowmelt. When he walked past the corner of 7 Alpha, he looked at the bank building that now sat on it brick and glass, and noted its condition in the way he noted the condition of all his buildings clinically, without sentiment. He did not call a lawyer. He did not pursue the matter with the county recorder. He did not confront Alderson again. What he did was document. Every year in his ledger, he made a note of the 7 Alpha situation as it stood. Not long notes. Sometimes just a single line. Lease on 7 Alpha continues. Agreement holds. Record secure. He did this the way he noted the depth of the water table and the price of soybeans and the condition of the east drainage tile, as a matter of record, as a matter of habit, as a matter of faith in the idea that what is precisely documented will survive what is carelessly managed. 1967. Harold paid off the equipment loan 18 months ahead of schedule. He noted this in his ledger with the same level of emotion he brought to noting the completion of any task, which is to say, very little. He went to Farmers Trust to collect his title and was charged a $3 document processing fee, which he paid without comment, and then noted in the ledger as a potential violation of Article 6 of the 1961 lease agreement, too small to pursue worth remembering. 1970, his neighbor, Frank Holloway's brother-in-law, a man named Dennis who had bought 400 acres east of Cedar Falls in 1966, using financing that Frank had always said was too aggressive, sold his farm at a loss after 3 consecutive years of below-average prices. Harold wrote in his ledger, "Dennis Keller sold east parcels. Debt load did not survive 2 bad years." This is the thing the bank salesmen do not tell you when they are showing you the new equipment. 1972, Gerald Alderson called the farm. Ruth answered and came to find Harold in the east field where he was running the cultivator. Harold walked back to the house, washed his hands, and picked up the phone. Alderson said he was calling on a personal matter. He said he was leaving Farmers Trust at the end of the month for a position at a larger institution in Iowa City. He said he wanted Harold to know before he left that there had been a situation some years back involving a document and a parcel of ground, and that he wanted Harold to know the institution understood the property lines correctly. He said this in the careful, indirect way of a man acknowledging something he is not able to name directly. Harold listened to all of it without speaking. When Alderson finished, Harold said, "I appreciate the call." Then he said goodbye and hung up. He went back to the barn office and opened the ledger to the current page and wrote, "Alderson called. Leaving the institution. Said the bank understands the property lines correctly. He knows I know. The record is secure." That was the entirety of the entry. Then he went back to the cultivator. Now, before we continue, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been in a situation where someone had done you a wrong, and you had the documentation to prove it, and you chose not to use it. Not because you were afraid, and not because you forgave them, but because you understood that the time was not right, and your job was to maintain the record and wait. That is a specific kind of discipline. That is a specific kind of patience that is not passive. It is not resignation. It is a long-term calculation about where power actually lives. Most people would have picked up the phone and called a lawyer in 1963. Harold Cole picked up a pen and wrote in his ledger. And 62 years later, his son walked into a courthouse with that ledger and changed the outcome of a $47 million transaction. Drop a comment and tell me which you would have done. Because I think most of us, if we are honest, would have gone to the lawyer. And I think Harold Cole knew something most of us do not. 1974. The oil embargo. Diesel prices tripled in the span of 8 months. 7 farms in Lynn County that had financed new equipment at the beginning of the decade found that the math no longer worked when fuel costs were added to their loan payments. Harold had paid off his equipment years earlier and had been running it with the careful maintenance philosophy his father had taught him. A machine that is paid for and properly maintained is worth more than a machine that is new and still owned by the bank. He did not experience the crisis the way his neighbors experienced it. He noted in his ledger 3rd fuel price increase in 5 months. Neighbors with debt in trouble. This is what debt does in a crisis. It turns a hard year into a last year. 1979. His son Walter left for Dubuque to take a job at a garage that was expanding its heavy equipment division. Harold drove him to the bus station on a Wednesday morning. They shook hands on the platform, which was how Harold and Walter expressed the things they did not know how to say any other way. On the drive back to the farm, Harold stopped at the corner of Highway 14 and County Road 22 and sat in his truck for a few minutes looking at the Farmers Trust branch building. It was 18 years old by then, the brick a little darker from the weather. A second drive-through lane added at some point in the mid-70s. He drove home. He noted in his ledger Walter gone to Dubuque. Good decision for him. 7 Alpha lease, year 18 of 99. 81 years remain. He liked to write that number. He liked watching it change each year. He liked the specific quality of commitment in a number that would outlast him. 1981, the farm crisis that everyone in Iowa had been watching gather on the horizon arrived fully. Interest rates peaked at 21.5%. Farmers who had borrowed at variable rates in the 70s were paying amounts that bore no relationship to what they had signed for. The agricultural lending system, which had spent a decade encouraging farmers to expand and modernize on credit, was now calling in loans it could no longer carry. 14 farms within 20 miles of Cedar Falls went into foreclosure that year. 3 of them belonged to men Harold had known since childhood. He watched this the way he watched difficult weather, with attention and without panic, because he had prepared for it. Not because he had predicted the specific crisis, but because he had always operated on the assumption that a crisis of some kind was always coming, and the only question was whether you would be in a position to absorb it when it arrived. He had no variable rate debt. He had no debt at all by this point. He had the farm, the equipment, the buildings, and 11 cloth-bound ledgers documenting every year of it. He wrote in his ledger that fall 14 foreclosures within 20 miles this year. The bank encouraged all of these men to borrow. The bank is now taking what they borrowed to buy. I'm not saying anything that is not already obvious to everyone watching, but I am writing it down because I want it to be part of the record. 1985, Ruth was diagnosed with a condition in her left hip that required surgery and a long recovery. Harold hired a young man from a neighboring farm to help with the planting season, while Ruth was in the hospital, and then again during the harvest. He noted the cost in his ledger, the number of days the young man worked, and a brief observation that Ruth had managed the recovery better than the doctors had predicted, which he attributed without elaboration to her character. 1994, he read in the Cedar Falls Gazette that Farmers Trust had been acquired by Great Plains National Bank, a regional institution headquartered in Des Moines, with assets exceeding $1 billion. The notice ran on page 4 of the business section below the fold, with a photograph of two men in suits shaking hands. Harold read the notice twice. Then he went to the barn office and retrieved the 1961 lease agreement from the filing cabinet and read Article 8, which contained the succession language. He noted in his ledger, Farmers Trust, acquired by Great Plains National Bank. Successor language in Article 8 applies. The agreement transfers. 7 Alpha lease year 33 of 99. He put the agreement back in the folder. He put the folder back in the filing cabinet. He went out to the barn and finished what he had been working on. He did not call a lawyer. He did not contact the new institution. He did not do anything except note the change in the ledger and trust that the document he had signed in 1961 meant what it said. This was the consistent posture of a man who believed without sentimentality that properly constructed agreements, honored by properly maintained records, were the most durable form of protection available to a person who did not have the resources to fight in court. You could not fight a bank with a bank. You could fight a document with a better document. 2002, Ruth passed away on a Sunday morning in April, in the bedroom that faced east. In the first light of a morning she had been watching come through that window for 47 years. Harold sat with her for a long time before he called anyone. He noted her death in his ledger that afternoon in a single paragraph that described her contribution to the farm. In specific terms, the books she had kept, the decisions she had improved by asking the right questions, the 31 planting seasons and 31 harvests she had been present for. He noted that she had understood the 7 Alpha situation from the beginning and had never once suggested he handle it differently. He wrote, "She trusted the record. She was right to." 2015, Harold Cole died on a Thursday morning in February at the age of 84, in the kitchen chair, closest to the window. He had been sitting in that chair to watch the light come up over the east field for 40 years. The ledger open on the table in front of him was number 11. The last entry was from the previous week, a notation about seed corn prices and the cost of propane for the grain dryer. He had been planning for a planting season he would not live to see. Walter came back to the farm to handle what needed handling. He arranged the burial. He managed the probate. He leased the land to a young couple from Olin who had been farming rented ground nearby and needed more acres. He sold the equipment through a farm auction house, watching his father's machinery go to strangers the way you watch anything that has been part of your life disappear, which is to say, quickly and finally and in a way that cannot be reversed. He paid the last utility bills and forwarded the mail and drained the pipes for winter. He stood in the barn office for a long time on the last day before he drove back to Dubuque, looking at the 11 ledgers on the shelf, the 3 metal filing cabinets, the fireproof safe in the floor. He knew the combination. His father had written it on the inside cover of the first ledger, which was exactly the kind of obvious hiding place that only someone who trusted his son's thoroughness would use. He did not open the safe. He did not read the ledgers. He told himself he would come back in the spring and deal with it properly. He did not come back in the spring. He did not come back the following year either. Every time he drove the county road past the farm, he found a reason to keep driving. Every time he thought about calling the couple from Olin to arrange a visit, something else came up. He knew exactly what was stopping him, and he knew it was not a good reason. And he did it anyway, which is one of the things that separates knowledge from action, and always has. The shoeboxes sat in the barn office for 10 years. It was Ellie who solved it in the way that certain people solve problems, which is to say, not by addressing them indirectly, but by making them impossible to avoid. She was 32 years old, worked as a farm operations accountant in Des Moines, and had her grandfather's quality of patience combined with her mother's quality of directness, which was a combination that Walter had learned over the years to respect, even when it made him uncomfortable. She called in October of 2024 and told him she was taking a week off in January and they were going to go through the shoeboxes, not as a question, as a plan with a date. They drove out to the farm on a Saturday morning in the second week of January 2025 with 2 thermoses of coffee and a notepad. The barn office was cold enough to see their breath. Ellie found the space heater behind the second filing cabinet and got it running while Walter stood in the middle of the room and let himself stand there for a minute, which was what he needed. Have you ever had someone do that for you? Force you back toward the thing you have been circling for years? Not through argument, but simply by showing up and making it no longer possible to postpone. I think most of us, if we are honest, know that without someone like that, we would still be standing outside the door. They started with the oldest shoebox. Most of it was expected. Loan agreements, price records, equipment receipts, letters from the county extension office. Walter read each one before setting it aside, not because he expected to find anything in particular, but because his father had kept them, and that meant they were worth reading. The second box held the 1980s and 1990s. The numbers in his father's handwriting told a story Walter knew in outline but had never seen in detail. The interest rates, the years when the margin was so thin it was nearly invisible, the careful notations of what each neighbor had borrowed and what each neighbor had eventually lost. Walter sat with those pages longer than the task required. The third box was where Ellie found the bank statements. She spread them on the workbench in order of date the way she sorted documents at her desk in Des Moines and worked through them methodically until she reached the last one. The final statement from Great Plains National Bank showed Harold Cole's account balance at the time of closure. $7,214, minus a deduction labeled Archival Title Search Fee, Parcel 7 Alpha in the amount of $312. Net balance transferred to estate $6,902. Ellie read the line twice. Then she put her finger on it and slid the statement across the workbench to her father without speaking. Walter looked at it. He read the label. He looked at the amount. He set the statement down and looked at the filing cabinet labeled 1959 to 1965 and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Get me the folder for 1961. He called the bank that Monday. A young man explained standard procedure and administrative necessity in current fee schedules. Walter asked about fee waivers in the account documentation. The young man said he would look into it. 2 days later, he called back and said there were no notations of any fee waivers in the account file. Walter thanked him and ended the call. Then he went back to the barn office and started reading. He read the 1961 lease agreement that night, at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, under the same light his father had used for 50 years. He read it the way he had learned to read service manuals, which was to say, slowly, and without skipping, because the thing you skipped was always the thing that mattered. He found Article 6 on page 2. The language was not ambiguous. Permanent waiver of all administrative, clerical, and records-related fees. Harold Raymond Cole and his direct heirs, for the duration of said accounts. He sat with that for a long time. He called Patricia Orr in Cedar Rapids the following week, not to ask whether he had a case, but to ask whether the document meant what he thought it meant. She read it and told him it appeared to mean exactly that the successor language in Article 8 was standard for the era, that Great Plains National Bank had inherited the obligation when it acquired Farmers Trust in 1994, and that the fee charged against Harold Cole's estate appeared to be a direct violation of the agreement. She said the matter was straightforward enough that he might not need a lawyer. He said he understood. He paid her consultation fee and drove home. He filed the small claims petition 3 weeks later for the amount of $312. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. What would you have done in Walter's position? You are 72 years old. You find a document your father signed in 1961. You find out a bank with $4 billion in assets has charged your father's estate a fee that violates an agreement they were legally obligated to honor. You discover as you dig further that the bank is 11 weeks away from closing a $47 million deal. Do you walk away? Do you take whatever they offer to make it quiet? Or do you drive 40 minutes to a small claims courthouse over $312? Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done, because I think that answer says something real about what a person believes is worth fighting for. The morning Ellie found out what her father had done, she called from Des Moines and sat on the phone for a moment without speaking, which was her way of organizing her thoughts when several things needed to be addressed at once. He told her what he had found and what he had filed. She said, "Pa, do you understand what that building is worth?" He said that was not the point. She said she was coming up for the hearing. He said that was not necessary. She came anyway. She drove out to the farm the weekend before the hearing and went through the third shoebox on her own, which was something she had been thinking about since she found the bank statement. She had a methodical mind that had been trained on agricultural financial records, and she brought it to the shoeboxes the way she brought it to everything, without assumption, working from the beginning toward the end, reading each document fully before moving to the next. She found page 11 in the third ledger at 11:30 on a Saturday night, under the light of the space heater and a single overhead bulb. The page was marked with a small folded corner, the way Harold Cole marked everything he needed to be able to find again. She unfolded the corner and read the entry twice. Then she sat in the cold barn office for a long time without moving. She made copies at the FedEx office in Des Moines on Sunday morning before she drove to Cedar Falls for the hearing. She organized them by date the way she organized everything and put them in the canvas bag she carried to the courthouse the next day. And she did not tell her father what she had found, because she was waiting to see if he would need it. He would. The small claims courtroom of Cedar Falls, Iowa, occupied a room on the second floor that smelled of radiator heat and old carpet. The ceiling was lower than it looked like it should be. The fluorescent lights gave the room a flat, colorless quality, the kind of light that makes everything look equally important and equally irrelevant. 6 rows of gallery benches, most of them empty. A water stain on the ceiling tile had been there so long it had faded from brown to the color of weak tea. Walter took a seat at the petitioner's table and set the envelope in front of him. Sandra Mercer was already at the respondent's table reviewing documents on a slim laptop. She glanced at Walter when he sat down. Then she looked at the envelope. Then she looked back at her screen. She had the composure of someone who has been in enough of these rooms to stop being curious about them. She saw an old man in a flannel shirt. She saw a padded envelope. She made her assessment in approximately 3 seconds and went back to her preparation. Frank Holloway came in from the hallway and settled into the back bench of the gallery, setting his cap on his knee. He was 70 years old, built like a man who had put in serious physical work for 5 decades, and he had driven 40 minutes from Buchanan County. because when Walter had called him 2 weeks ago to say he was going to a courthouse over something his father had signed in 1961, Frank had said, without thinking about it, that he would be there. He owed Harold Cole that much. He owed Harold Cole considerably more than that if he was being precise. Judge Raymond Holt entered at 9:02. He was 68 years old, had been on the district bench for 30 years, and moved with the economy of a man who had learned that unnecessary motion was simply another form of wasted time. He sat. He looked at the docket. He looked at the petitioner. He looked at the respondent. He had the expression of a man who had seen enough variation in human behavior to be genuinely curious about very little, but who still occasionally was. Cole versus Great Plains National Bank, he said. Petitioner seeks recovery of a records retrieval fee in the amount of $312. He paused. Is that correct? Walter said it was. Sandra Mercer confirmed it was. The judge nodded and asked the respondent to begin. Sandra Mercer rose with the unhurried confidence of someone who has already decided how a thing will end. She spoke of archival retrieval protocols and industry standard practices, and the administrative costs associated with closing accounts connected to historical mortgage records. She said, standard procedure twice. She said, bank policy once. She acknowledged with a small professional smile that $312 was not an insignificant sum, and that the bank sympathized with the inconvenience. Then she sat down in a way that suggested the matter was concluded. She had spoken for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. She had not looked at Walter once during that time. Judge Holt looked at Walter. Let us hear from you, he said. Walter stood. He opened the envelope, removed the 1961 lease agreement, unfolded it, and placed it on the table. Then he stated plainly and without elaboration that the fee had been charged against an account protected by Article 6 of the agreement, that the agreement was binding on Great Plains National Bank as the successor institution to Farmers Trust of Cedar Falls, and that the charge was a violation of its terms. He slid the document toward the judge. Sandra Mercer's posture shifted by approximately 2 degrees. It was not much. It was enough. She had expected a claim. She had prepared for a claim. What she had not expected was the specific language of Article 6, which she could see from where she sat, was not the kind of vague handshake language that dissolved under examination, but the kind of precise, intentional language that a careful man had insisted on, and a careless institution had agreed to without fully understanding what it was agreeing to. Judge Holt read Article 6. Then he read Article 8, the succession clause. He set the document down and looked at Sandra Mercer with an expression that was not quite skepticism, but occupied adjacent territory. Counselor, he said, this document states that its terms are binding on all successors and assigns of the lender. That is standard legal language in property agreements of this era. Are you contending that Great Plains National Bank was unaware of this agreement at the time of acquisition? Sandra Mercer said the agreement had apparently been lost during the digitization of archival records, that this was a common occurrence in large-scale acquisitions involving multiple predecessor institutions, that it was an administrative oversight rather than a policy decision. The judge received this explanation with a neutrality that was difficult to read. He looked back at the document. Walter reached into the envelope and removed a second document, a photocopy of a notice from the Cedar Falls Gazette dated March 3rd, 2025. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward the judge without speaking. The notice described the pending sale of Great Plains National Bank's Iowa branch network to a regional banking group headquartered in Omaha. The sale was valued at $47 million. Among the assets being transferred were the buildings and grounds of 11 branch locations across eastern Iowa, including the Cedar Falls branch at the intersection of Highway 14 and County Road 22, the building that sat on Parcel 7 Alpha, the building that Harold Cole had never sold. Judge Holt read the notice. He set it beside the agreement. He looked at both documents without speaking. Then he looked at Sandra Mercer, and the neutrality in his expression shifted into something that had more weight to it. In the back of the gallery, Frank Holloway had taken his cap off his knee without noticing he had done it. He was holding it in both hands and looking at the padded envelope on Walter's table and thinking about a Saturday evening in the summer of 1961, when Harold had come over after supper and told him about the deal with the bank. Frank had asked if he was sure giving up that corner for a century on the promise that an institution would hold up its end. Harold had looked at him in the way he looked at things he had already decided. Past the point of argument, settled somewhere deep. He had said the ground is not gone, it is lent. There is a difference that matters more than the number of years. Frank had not fully understood at the time what Harold meant by that. Sitting in the Cedar Falls courthouse 64 years later, holding his cap in both hands, he thought he might be beginning to. Sandra Mercer said she would need to consult with her client before proceeding further. Judge Holt gave her 15 minutes. She walked out with her phone already at her ear. In the back row of the gallery, a man in a dark suit had settled quietly during the recess that preceded this moment. He was 41 years old, worked for a law firm in Des Moines, and had driven to Cedar Falls that morning as part of routine due diligence on the acquisition his firm was handling. $47 million, 11 properties. Standard protocol to observe any outstanding legal proceedings involving those properties, however minor they appeared. This proceeding had appeared very minor. He was composing a message to his senior partner, now organized in bullet points. He sent it. The response came in 40 seconds. The first sentence said, to get a complete copy of the court record. The second sentence said, the client had been informed. He looked at the two documents on the judge's table and thought about the clause in the acquisition agreement regarding unresolved property disputes and the automatic suspension it triggered, and what a $47 million suspension looked like from the perspective of everyone involved in closing it. He put his phone in his pocket and watched the front of the room. Sandra Mercer came back through the door at 12 minutes and 40 seconds. The composure was still present, but it required maintenance now in a way it had not required maintenance at 9:02 that morning. She had the look of someone operating under instructions received under pressure, constructing the appropriate professional surface over a situation that had changed significantly since breakfast. She said, the bank acknowledged the materials raised questions requiring further investigation, and proposed that the appropriate venue for addressing disputes about the 1961 agreement would be a civil court proceeding with full discovery. She then said, in the smooth, efficient delivery of someone presenting an offer designed to close a conversation, that in the interest of resolving the immediate matter, Great Plains National Bank wished to offer a settlement in the amount of $85,000, inclusive of full reimbursement of the disputed fee compensation for the petitioner's time and effort, and a mutual release of all claims related to the 1961 agreement and the current status of Parcel 7 Alpha. She delivered this number with the quiet confidence of someone who has calibrated an offer. Precisely who knows that $85,000 is more than enough to satisfy the kind of man who drives 40 minutes to a courthouse over $312. Walter looked at her. Then he said no. Sandra Mercer said she begged your pardon. Walter said the answer was no. The agreement stands. He was not interested in a release of claims. Sandra Mercer shifted approaches with the practiced smoothness of someone who has prepared for resistance. She said that the fee waiver provision was a de minimis benefit worth perhaps a few $100s per decade, and that $85,000 represented a settlement far in excess of any conceivable value the agreement could produce over its remaining term. She said this with a precision that carried a faint edge, the tone of someone explaining to another person why they should not want the thing they want. Walter said he understood her arithmetic. He said the issue was not the value of the fee waiver. He said the issue was what the 1963 document meant. She waited. He said that his father had documented in March of 1963 that someone at Farmers Trust had brought him a deed purporting to transfer 7 Alpha that he had not signed, and that the legal description in that deed did not match the actual boundaries of 7 Alpha, as established in the 1961 survey. He said that document was now being presented by Great Plains National Bank as evidence that the 1961 agreement had been superseded. He said the question of how that document came to exist and what it actually describes is not a question that $85,000 resolves. Sandra Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then she said the bank's offer stood, and she encouraged the petitioner to consider it carefully. Judge Holt looked at Walter. He asked if he had anything to add regarding the 1963 document. Walter turned over a photocopy that had been sitting face down on the table and slid it toward the judge. It was page 11 of Harold Cole's third ledger. March 7th, 1963. 3 days after the date on the deed transfer document. The handwriting was Harold's, formed with the deliberateness of a man who believed that what he wrote might one day matter to someone who was not yet born. Judge Holt read it aloud in the flat, careful voice of a man reading a legal document. Received visit from Alderson and a man I did not know. They brought a document they said I had signed transferring 7 Alpha outright. I have not signed such a document. I told them this. Alderson said there must be a confusion, and they would look into it. After they left, I examined the document carefully. The legal description of the parcel in the transfer deed does not match the survey boundaries of 7 Alpha, as established in the 1961 agreement. The metes and bounds described in the 1963 deed correspond to the parcel I have always called 7 Beta, the smaller eastern strip I sold to the Hendersons for a grain elevator access road in 1965. The documents concern 2 different parcels. I'm keeping this entry and the survey maps in the safe. If this is ever needed, I want it to be found. He set the photocopy down. Walter had read that entry enough times now that he could feel the particular weight of the last line before he reached it. He had also found below the main notation, written in slightly smaller letters in the hand of a man who had not quite finished writing, and needed to say one more thing. I do not know if this will be enough. I am going to act as though it will be. The judge looked at Sandra Mercer. She said the bank would need time to review these materials and consult with its legal team before responding further. Judge Holt gave her 20 minutes. She left the room. The door swung shut. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when something has shifted that cannot be shifted back. In the corner at the small table beside the judge's bench, the court clerk had set down her pen. Her name was Margaret Dawson. She was 72 years old and had worked in the Cedar Falls court system for 28 years. Before that, she had worked in banking and financial administration, beginning in 1962, when she was hired as a junior records clerk at Farmers Trust of Cedar Falls. She was looking at the 1963 deed document from across the room. She could see the notary seal from where she sat. She could see the name printed beneath it. She was very still. Judge Holt had spent 30 years on the bench developing the ability to recognize when someone in his courtroom had something to say. He looked at his clerk. He asked if she would like to say something. Margaret Dawson set her hands on the table in front of her. She said, "Your Honor, I may have relevant information regarding that document." The room changed. Not loudly. It simply became more attentive the way a room becomes attentive when the number of people who understand what is happening increases by even one. Judge Holt said he would hear it. Margaret Dawson spoke in the measured way of someone who has learned over a long professional life to say exactly what she means and nothing beyond it. She said that in 1962 and 1963, she had been employed as a junior records clerk at Farmers Trust of Cedar Falls. She said that part of her duties had included assisting with document preparation and on certain occasions serving as a preliminary witness in the processing of administrative papers. Though she had not at that time been a licensed notary. She paused. She said she remembered the 7 Alpha transaction. She said she had been asked in the spring of 1963 to help prepare a deed transfer document related to that parcel, and had been told by her supervisor that Harold Cole had agreed to sell the property. She had done the preliminary paperwork, but she had not been present when the document was signed. She had not notarized it. She had not been authorized to notarize it. She said that a senior officer of the bank had taken the prepared document and told her it would be handled from that point. She had returned to her other work. She had not thought about it again until this morning. She said that the name M. Dawson on the notary seal of the 1963 deed was her name. She said the signature beneath it was not her signature. The room was very quiet. In the gallery, Frank Holloway was holding his cap in both hands and looking at the floor. In the second row, Ellie had her canvas bag on her lap and both hands on it. The man in the dark suit in the back row had stopped composing messages. Sandra Mercer came back through the door at 19 minutes. She arranged her papers with the precision of someone buying small amounts of time. She said the bank acknowledged that the materials raised questions requiring further investigation. She said that in recognition of the petitioner's diligence, Great Plains National Bank wished to offer a settlement. She said the same number, $85,000. Mutual release of claims. Walter looked at her. Then he said no again. He said the question of how the 1963 document came to exist was not a question. $85,000 resolves. Judge Holt asked Walter if he had the original survey of Parcel 7 Alpha. Walter reached into the padded envelope and removed a folded document, older than the lease agreement. Its edges softened with age. He unfolded it and placed it on the table. A property survey dated June 1961, bearing the stamp of a licensed surveyor from Lynn County. He also placed beside it a second survey dated 1964, showing Parcel 7 Beta and its boundaries prepared in advance of the sale to the Henderson family for the grain elevator access road. Judge Holt asked Margaret Dawson to bring both surveys and the 1963 deed to his bench. She did. He spent several minutes comparing them in silence, moving his finger along the lines of text in the 1963 deed and then along the coordinates on each survey map. Then he set everything down. He said without inflection that the legal description of the parcel in the 1963 deed, specifically the metes and bounds beginning at the northeast corner of the described property and running south along the fence line, corresponded to the survey coordinates of Parcel 7 Beta, not 7 Alpha. He said the documents described two different pieces of land. Sandra Mercer was looking at the documents from across the room. She could not see them clearly from where she stood, but she did not need to. The judge's tone had told her what she needed to know, and she was already past this room in her mind, already in the next sequence of calls and consultations, already understanding the shape of what the following weeks were going to look like. She said this was clearly an archival error of significant complexity, and the bank would need time to investigate its origins. Judge Holt said he expected it would. He said the matter before him had originated as a small claims dispute over a fee of $312 and had become something considerably larger. He said the question of the 1963 document's validity, given the surveying discrepancy, and the questions about notarization, was not a question he could resolve in this court. He said he was going to refer the full record to district court for review. He looked at Sandra Mercer. He said the referral would include all materials presented that morning and that the court would be noting in its referral that questions had been raised regarding the authenticity and accuracy of the 1963 deed. Sandra Mercer said she understood. Judge Holt struck his gavel once. The sound was not loud. It did not echo. It was the sound of a thing concluded, which, in this case, meant that a thing much larger had just begun. Sandra Mercer gathered her documents and left without looking at Walter. The man in the dark suit was already in the hallway on his phone, speaking in the low, urgent voice of someone delivering information that cannot wait. Frank Holloway remained in his seat for a moment, holding his cap in both hands, looking at the front of the room where the documents were still spread across the table. He thought about Harold Cole in a barn office in March of 1963, writing in his ledger by the light from the north-facing window, writing it all down. The visit, the document, the forged signature, the discrepancy in the metes and bounds, writing it down and putting it in the safe and going back to work, not calling a lawyer, not going to the county recorder, just documenting it precisely and trusting that the record would find its moment. That was the kind of faith that was hard to name and harder to hold for 62 years. Walter was carefully replacing the documents into the padded envelope when Frank came down from the gallery and stood beside the table. He did not say much. He said it was a hell of a thing what Harold had done keeping it like that. Walter said his father had understood something about time that most people did not get the chance to learn. He said keeping was not the same as forgetting, and it was not the same as forgiving. It was understanding that the right time for a thing was not always the time you first encountered it, and that your job in the interval was to maintain the record and not let it get lost. Frank nodded. He put his cap on. They walked out together into the courthouse corridor and down the stairs and out through the front doors into the pale March air. 2 days before the district court letter arrived, a notice appeared in the Iowa Business Register. The acquisition agreement between Great Plains National Bank and the Omaha Banking Group had been placed in voluntary suspension, pending resolution of a title dispute on an Iowa branch property. No dollar amount was mentioned, no parcel name, just the suspension and a closing date that no longer existed. The man in the dark suit had filed his bullet point report before he reached his car. The letter from the district court arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after the hearing. Walter was at the kitchen table with the third ledger open when Ellie brought it in from the mailbox. He set down his coffee and opened it. Judge Carol Whitfield of the Iowa District Court for Lynn County had reviewed the materials submitted by the small claims court and determined that the matter required expedited handling, given the pending property transaction referenced in the public record. She had issued a temporary order staying the closing of the acquisition agreement pending resolution of the dispute over Parcel 7 Alpha. The order cited the unresolved questions about the 1963 deed and the claim of a conflicting prior interest in the property. Hearing date 6 weeks out. Ellie sat down across from him. She said a stay on a $47 million transaction was not a small thing. Walter said he understood that. She said the bank would have significant motivation to reach a resolution before the hearing. He said he expected they would be in touch. She said he should have a lawyer before they were. He said Patricia Orr had already told him the document meant what he thought it meant. Ellie said that was a consultation. She said what was coming next was a negotiation, and that a negotiation of this scale was not the same category of thing as a consultation, and that he should not walk into it alone. Walter looked at his daughter. She had her mother's directness, which he had always found easier to accept from her mother, and was still learning at 72 to accept from Ellie. He said he would call Patricia Orr in the morning. Ellie said good. Before he made the call, he drove out to the farm and sat in the barn office for an hour. He turned on the space heater. He sat in the wooden chair behind the workbench. The same chair Harold had sat in, and looked at the safe in the floor, and the filing cabinets in the north-facing window, and thought about his father at 43. Receiving the careful phone call from Alderson, writing 2 sentences in the ledger. He knows I know. The record is secure. He thought about what it would have taken to do what Harold did, not just in 1963, when the document appeared, not just in 1972 when Alderson called, but in every year in between and every year after, walking the fence line every March, writing the annual note in the ledger, watching the number of remaining years on the lease count down from 99 toward nothing, keeping all of it precisely trusting, all of it completely, and never saying a word to anyone outside the family. That was not passivity. That was the hardest kind of discipline. That was a man who understood that some things are better witnessed than prosecuted, that the existence of a precise record is its own form of accountability, that the truth of a thing can survive the people who would prefer it did not exist if someone is careful enough and patient enough to keep it correctly. Harold Cole had kept it correctly for 62 years. The paper had outlasted everyone who had created the problem. Patricia Orr called Monday after reviewing the full file. She said the situation was considerably more significant than their initial consultation had indicated. She said the bank would be looking for a resolution, and the question was what Walter was willing to accept. Walter said he wanted the 1961 agreement honored and properly recorded with the county, which had apparently never been done. He wanted an explicit acknowledgement in writing that the 1963 deed described a different parcel and had no effect on the 7 Alpha lease. He wanted the $312 fee refunded. Patricia said she would convey those terms. The bank's counteroffer came the following afternoon. Full restatement of the 1961 agreement properly recorded, the fee refunded with interest, and a payment to Walter of $250,000 in exchange for a covenant not to sue regarding the origins of the 1963 document. Walter said he would think about it. He drove out to the farm. He sat in the kitchen and read the third ledger from the beginning of 1963 through the end of that year, and then through 1972, when Alderson called, and then through the years when Harold had noted the acquisition of Farmers Trust by Great Plains National Bank, and written in careful letters that the successor language applies. He read the entry from the fall of Harold's last good year, 2014, when he had noted the 7 Alpha lease at year 53 of 99, and written 46 years remain after me. Walter will need to know. He had not known. He had not known because he had not read the ledgers. He had not read them because he had not been able to open the barn office door without his father being there, and then not being there. And that was a grief he had let get between him and the thing Harold had left for him to find. He thought about his father writing that sentence. Walter will need to know. Writing it not as a rebuke, but as a statement of fact. The way Harold wrote everything without sentiment and without complaint, simply as an item in the ongoing record of a life managed with care. He called Patricia Orr the next morning. He said he would accept the offer on 2 conditions. The first condition was that the restated agreement include a clause explicitly confirming that the 1963 deed had described Parcel 7 Beta and not, parcel 7 alpha, and that it had therefore never constituted a valid conveyance of the leased parcel, and that the 1961 lease had remained in continuous effect without interruption. He said he wanted that language in the public record permanently, so that whoever examined the title in the future would find the full history accurately stated. The second condition was that the $250,000 be placed in a trust for Ellie. Patricia Orr was quiet for a moment. Walter said it was not his money to keep. He said Ellie had been the one who went through the shoeboxes, the one who found page 11, the one who drove back to make copies before the hearing, and sat in the gallery with the documents in her canvas bag in case he needed them. He said the money belonged to whoever had understood what needed to be done and had done it. That was Ellie. Patricia Orr said she would convey the conditions. The bank agreed to both within 48 hours. The closing happened 3 weeks later in Patricia Orr's office in Cedar Rapids. There were more lawyers around the conference table than Walter had ever been in a room with at one time. The senior lawyer for Great Plains National Bank was a man in his late 50s named Garrett, who shook Walter's hand with a firmness that communicated respect without quite communicating what the respect was for. The new agreement was 41 pages. Walter read it the night before at the kitchen table in Harold's house, under the same light his father had used for 50 years. Article 3 stated plainly that the instrument designated as the 1963 deed of sale had been determined through review of historical survey records to describe parcel 7 beta and not parcel 7 alpha, that it had accordingly never constituted a valid conveyance of the leased parcel, and that the lease agreement of July 14, 1961 had remained in continuous effect from the date of its execution to the present day. He read that section 3 times. Then he signed where Patricia indicated. Garrett shook his hand again on the way out. He said in a quiet voice that the other lawyers were not quite close enough to hear that it was clear Mr. Cole's father had kept very thorough records. Walter said that he had. Garrett nodded once and looked at the floor for a moment, in the particular way of a man acknowledging something he is not in a position to say directly. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked to the elevator. By the following week, the story had moved the way stories move in agricultural eastern Iowa, which is to say through the grain elevator in Olin and the co-op in Cedar Falls, and the diner on County Road 22, where the table nearest the window was occupied every morning by the same 6 men who had been occupying it for 30 years. Frank Holloway told it first, not as a boast, but as a report the way he reported anything that had happened and seemed worth knowing. He told it the way Harold would have told it, with the details in the right order and without embellishment. And the man who heard it told it to the next man who came in and sat down. And by the end of the week, there were people across the county who knew the name 7 Alpha and what it meant. What they talked about specifically was not the settlement number. They talked about the ledgers. They talked about a man who had kept 11 cloth-bound records of every year of his farming life, who had written down the visit from Alderson in March of 1963 and put the document in the safe and gone back to work. They talked about the folded corner on page 11. They talked about the way Harold had written at the bottom of that page in slightly smaller letters that he did not know if it would be enough, but that he was going to act as though it would be. At the grain elevator, a man named Elmer Briggs, who was 68 years old and had been farming the same ground his grandfather had broken, said he was going home that evening and starting a ledger. He said it not as a joke. 2 men said they were going to do the same. Walter drove back to Cedar Falls that evening. He stopped the truck at the corner of Highway 14 and County Road 22 and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at the Cedar Falls branch of Great Plains National Bank across the intersection. The drive-through lanes were busy. The parking lot was half full. The building looked exactly the way it had always looked. Brick and glass set back from the road, with the landscape frontage and the canopy over the drive-through. It looked like a bank. It was sitting on land his father had never sold. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel vindicated exactly. He felt something quieter than either of those things. He felt that his father had been right about everything that mattered, and that the cost of that rightness had been paid in a currency that was not money, but was more durable than money. 50 years of precise documentation, of careful patience, of faith, in the idea that what is truly recorded cannot be truly erased. He pulled back onto the road and drove home. That night he found the ledger on the kitchen table where he had left it. He turned to the first blank page after Harold's final entry from February 2015. He thought for a moment about what to write, because he was not his father, and he knew it. And he was not going to pretend that he could write the way Harold wrote with that particular combination of precision and restraint. But there was one entry that belonged in the record. One entry that Harold had left a blank page for, without knowing he was leaving it. He wrote the date. He wrote a summary of the events from January through April of 2025. The shoebox, the bank statement, the 1961 agreement, the courthouse, the district court referral, the settlement. He noted the recording number of the restated lease agreement now on file with Lynn County. He noted Patricia Orr's contact information. He noted that the $250,000 was in trust for Eleanor Grace Cole, his daughter, and he noted the trust instrument number. Then he wrote one more line. The record was kept. The agreement was honored. The farm is still ours. He closed the ledger. He set it on the shelf with the other 11. Then he washed his coffee cup and turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hall to the bedroom that faced east. He thought about calling Frank Holloway, who had left a message asking if things had gone the right way. He would call tomorrow. Frank was the kind of man who did not need the call that night. He thought about Ellie, who had driven back to Des Moines, but had mentioned before she left that the couple from Olin had asked her at the co-op whether there was any chance the lease might be renewed on different terms when the current agreement expired in 3 years. She had said she had not told them anything because it was not her decision to make. And Walter had looked at her and said he thought it might be partly her decision if she wanted it to be. She had not answered. She had looked at her coffee, but she had not said no. He thought about the ledger on the shelf. 12 volumes now, the record running from 1958 to 2025, with a gap of 10 years between Harold's last entry and his first. And how that gap was itself a kind of record, a record of the time it takes a man to be ready for something he has been putting off. He thought about whoever would write in it after Ellie in whatever handwriting they had, with whatever tools they used in whatever year they found themselves doing it. He thought about the obligation he was leaving them, the same obligation Harold had left him. Keep the record, honor the agreement, know what you have, and know what it is worth, and never confuse the price of a thing with its value. Some things are not for growing crops, his father had said, standing in July heat beside a fence post at the corner of the 2-acre strip, his hand briefly on the back of his 8-year-old son's neck. Some things are for making sure your neighbors have water to drink. Walter had been 8 years old and had not understood. He understood it now. His father had not been talking about the specific 2 acres or the specific bank or even the specific agreement. He had been talking about a principle. He had been talking about the idea that a man who owns something has responsibilities that extend beyond his own lifetime. That the things worth keeping are rarely the things with the highest price, and that the keeping is itself a form of work, quiet and daily and invisible to anyone who is not paying close attention, but as real and as consequential as any other work a man does with his hands. Harold Cole had kept that kind of work up for 50 years. He had kept it through droughts and farm crises and the deaths of neighbors and the death of his wife and the slow dissolution of the rural world he had been born into. He had kept it through the acquisition that swallowed the small institution that had made the original agreement, and through the decade when his son could not bring himself to open the barn office door. He had kept it in 11 ledgers and 3 filing cabinets and a fireproof safe in a concrete floor. And he had marked the page he needed someone to find with a small folded corner. And he had written in the only place where he ever allowed himself anything. Approaching doubt, I do not know if this will be enough. I am going to act as though it will be. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. The east field was dark outside the window. The owl in the north stand called once, and then was quiet. Harold Cole's house settled around Walter in the particular way of old houses that have been lived in long enough to know what they are for. In the county registry, the restated agreement was now indexed under Parcel 7 Alpha. Cole to Farmers Trust. 1961 restated and confirmed 2025 with a notation that the title history was complete and the lease currently in effect. Anyone who searched that parcel in the future would find the full record, the original lease, the dispute, the resolution, all of it present and accounted for, nothing missing, nothing lost. The books were balanced. The promise was kept.